Last week's lesson, we talked about making God's doctrine or God's teaching attractive, adorning the doctrine of God. And we tried to emphasize that in the pastoral epistles and in other places, instructions are given in light of the fact that people are watching us. And they watch what we say, they watch what we do, they listen to us to see whether the things we stand for are consistent with the things that we say and do. And today in lesson 10, in talking about some things to avoid, we hope to look at some things that will help us in accomplishing those things that we need to be doing to make God's doctrine attractive or adorning God's doctrine. The primary text I listed for the lesson for today is from the book of Titus, chapter 3, verse 9 is the primary text. Paul tells Titus, "But avoid foolish controversies, genealogies, dissensions, and quarrels about the law, for they are unprofitable and worthless." Now, we're going to look at some companion passages that talk about other things that are to be avoided. He lists several things here that he tells Titus in his guidance to Titus, as Titus would then use that guidance in his instructions and his teachings to avoid certain things. One of the reasons that I chose this is because I don't really have a question about the context here, but it probably won't surprise you that I'm going to talk about the context in this passage and some other passages. If you back up one verse, the saying is what? Faithful, or as my translation says, trustworthy. And of course, that's what we've entitled the series of lessons, is trustworthy sayings. And we indicated at the very beginning, not every lesson is based on a context that uses the word faithful or trustworthy saying, but this one does. And he says in verse 8, "This saying is trustworthy, and I want you to insist on these things so that those who have believed in God may be careful to devote themselves to good works. For these things are excellent and profitable for people." The primary text begins with the word "but." Obviously, when you see that, you're going to see that there's a contrast being laid out here. He's saying avoid certain things, but he doesn't just leave it at that. He talks about certain things to do, and we'll talk about that a little bit more in just a minute. And the first question I asked when he says avoids certain things, including foolish controversies, why does he say to avoid those? What did you say on that? What reason does he give?
Division.
All right. They cause division, dissension,
No profit.
no profit, no benefit. Those are all bad things. If it's unprofitable, if it's worthless or useless, if it causes division, obviously that would be something that we want to avoid. Now, he lists specifically foolish controversies. What is a foolish controversy? Who could give the best answer for what a foolish controversy is?
Being baptized and not being baptized.
All right, you want to elaborate on that?
Well, the thing is, the law says we are to be baptized. And the controversy says, well, another congregation, another church will say, oh yeah, well, we don't do that.
Okay,
So you gotta be prepared to say, oh, this is what God says, and that's the way it goes.
so what you're saying is it's a foolish controversy if there's a controversy about something that God plainly teaches.
Exactly.
Am I understanding what you're saying?
Yes.
Okay. Joe, did you have?
Circumcision at the time was greatly divided about circumcising the Gentiles. You need to be circumcised.
Okay. Joe said about the issue of circumcision. The Jews were, in New Testament times, we can see the Jews often were insisting that Gentile converts be circumcised. And that got to be a controversy at times, did it not? And that might be a foolish controversy. We'll talk about that a little bit more in just a minute. Yes, ma'am.
Mine says foolish questions.
Okay.
Same difference, but in my mind, it means don't argue with people about stuff that really doesn't matter.
Okay.
You know, people can get into these wild arguments about things, religious or not. And I just take that as a general, don't do that.
Okay.
What purpose is it?
And I think you're getting into the area of the point I was wanting to make. So thank you for that. If we look at the list here, I think it gives us some clue as to what Paul specifically has in mind in these instructions to Titus. Foolish controversies. What's the next thing? Genealogies. Do you know anybody today that makes big arguments out of genealogies? Probably not so much today. What was going on in the setting when this was written to Titus? Who would be arguing about genealogies? Yes, the Jews, especially Jewish brethren. He's saying, and I think this would be under the heading of foolish controversies. But many of the Jews went to incredible lengths to try to document their genealogy going back centuries, and took a lot of pride in that and so forth. And sometimes it would devolve into arguments about that. You believe your genealogy includes this, but I don't think it does. And let's argue about that. Or my genealogy is really superior to your genealogy, and back and forth and so forth. And at the end of the day, what difference did it make? It might make a difference in their mind about their Jewish heritage, but what difference did it make as far as being a child of God? In the service of the Lord, in his church, it made no difference whatsoever.
Dave.
Hi.
I could have been all this. Years ago, the church used to debate denominationalism. And we wore them out. They got some people that were debating, we would always win, and they would get angry. And their anger would actually keep them from joining or agreeing with the church. And we stopped debating because of that, because controversy. And I remember the debates. I've got some copies of the old-fashioned debates. And that's a controversy that has gone by. However, within the church, a lot of times people run into people who advocate other things that's in the Bible, and they don't know how to defend it one-on-one.
That's true. Which leads me to this question. Is every controversy about things in religion a foolish controversy? You're correct.
Eternal
Yes. Most of you are shaking heads no, and I think that's the correct answer. He talks about foolish controversies. He doesn't just say avoid controversies. He says avoid foolish controversies. Now, he goes on here and talks about genealogies, dissensions, and quarrels about the law. There were very minute things that people argued about the law. Some of them, they would insist were part of the law, and I think he's talking about here the law of Moses. That's my view on this, going along with the genealogies and so forth. But there were a lot of things that were passed down, especially by the rabbis. Some of them mystical kinds of things, and they would insist that this was part of the law and was very important. Other people would say, well, that's not really part of the law. That's not what it meant, and so forth. And they would argue back and forth. A lot of rabbi discussions and so forth. Todd, did you have a
Jumping back to genealogies just really quickly. The first thing that I thought of today, you said that's not something we really do today, and I've never really heard anybody do that. But I think more the modern day thought of that is name dropping. How often have I run across, people that, well, I know brother so-and-so, or I know this guy over here, or I know this preacher who preaches over here, and, when through the conversation, there's like 30 people all of a sudden, and it's, and it's almost the mindset of, I'm going to know my way into heaven.
Yeah, that's when people get up and they talk about some preacher that's well known, and they refer to that person as my good friend, brother so-and-so. Now, that's not really a controversy, but at the end of the day, what difference does it make whether that person's your good friend or not? Or a lot of other things. I think that's a legitimate point. We may not argue as much about genealogies. We may not have controversies about genealogies, but I think it goes back to what was said earlier, arguing back and forth and back and forth and back and forth about things that really, at the end of the day, don't matter that much. Sometimes we need to stop and think, okay, you're of this opinion and I'm of that opinion, but really, will either one of those keep us out of heaven? You ever heard people argue about where did Cain's wife come from? It's his sister. What difference does it make? Is one thing I would say. We don't really argue that much about genealogies. Did death exist in any form on the earth before Adam and Eve sinned? Some people will argue that not only did death not happen to humans, but there was no death even among animals.
They have skins.
Yeah.
Clothing.
And I would agree with that. I think that, but some people from Romans 5, when it talks, Paul there is talking about death when it began, and it spread to all men because all men sinned and so forth. And there are some people that really will say that that sin started death not only among humans but among creatures in general. Yes.
I misspoke. That was after the sin.
Okay. My point would be, what difference does that make about whether animals died or not? Because Romans 5 clearly is talking about men, if you look at the context. Because death spread to all men because all sinned. What light existed on the earth before the fourth day of creation?
God's light.
What exactly was Paul's thorn in the flesh? Oh, I think it was that he had a physical deformity. Well, I think he was blind, or at least had some sight impairment or something like that, or whatever. What will our resurrected body actually look like? And on and on and on. I believe those are things today that people, they ruminate about that, and they get all in a dither sometimes about something like that. What difference does it really make at the end of the day? If you're going to have a controversy about that, I think Paul would say that's foolish, a foolish controversy. And he says, avoid that. Steer clear of that. Don't get all caught up in that. Now, we get back to some things like baptism and have a controversy about baptism or something like that. Or as Alan said, things that have eternal consequences. I think we would be on thin ice to talk about that as a foolish controversy. It might be a controversy, but I don't think it's foolish because of the clear issues as far as our teaching is concerned. Joe, did you have something else you want to say?
Yeah, I was just gonna say there's a lot of folks on the internet and TV that are bringing up when Jesus is coming back, the last days. You know, this is definitely the last days.
Mm-hmm.
It's every generation.
Yeah. Well, we know it's the last days. Now, trying to nail down a specific date among the last days gets to be rather foolish because of clear passages that say that day and hour knows no man, only the Father. And so that's, he says, avoid that. But in the context of all this, he's talking about some things to do. Some people criticize the Bible itself, especially unbelievers who say, well, the Bible is just a series of don't do this, don't do that, don't do this, don't do that, don't. Well, we're going to notice in the context of this and some other passages, that's not the case. Yes, there are some don'ts. There's some avoid, steer clear of some things. And by steering clear, we can help make God's doctrine attractive. But there are also some do's as well. Let's look at question 2. Somebody get ready to read 2 Timothy 2:23. Paul also tells Timothy to avoid foolish controversies. What reason does he give? Someone read that passage, please.
But refuse foolish and ignorant speculations, knowing that they produce quarrels.
They produce quarrels. And what's implied about the quarrels?
That's not a good thing.
That's not a good thing. Steer clear of it. Avoid that. All it does is make a platform for people to argue and argue and argue. Now, let's look at one more question here. Number 3, in Titus 3:10, that's the verse after our primary text, Paul indicates that, I tell you what, let me stop right there. What error do you see in question number 3? Yes, thank you. And for future iterations of this, that will be corrected. What I said, in Titus 3:10, Paul indicates that the things to avoid in the primary text might stir up what? How was Timothy to react? Well, it should be Titus. How was Titus to react to a person who did this? And the answer to that is, how was he to react?
Reject. Well, it says in Titus to reject a factious man.
Okay. You reject him outright?
Warn them first, or admonish them first. Maybe
Okay. Admonish him once and twice, and on the third time, that's the third strike. And he says, admonish him, and then this version says, after warning him once, then twice, have nothing more to do with him. Now, We're going to know some other things from other passages outside the pastoral epistles, some other situations where people will say, if a person's doing this and this and this and continues in it, after a while, you got to cut some ties. And these are serious warnings and admonitions that are given here. He says it's these things stir up division, and we talked about that earlier. Something that stirs up division. One of the 7 things that God hates is what? He who sows discord among brethren. God doesn't look very kindly upon that. Something that stirs up division or sows discord among brethren. Now, again, I did ask a specific question about the context of some of these passages.
David, I think a lot of times too, a judgment, people judge, that has to be a factor in all that. Because, they're judging, like, you're judging, I'm judging you, and then you're gonna go tell somebody else, you know what they did? And then here the judgment goes down and down and down, and that can cause a real big mess.
Yes, it can. So does that mean that we are forbidden from making judgments? No, it does not. Again, we have to use the brain that the Lord gave us to discern among some of these things, just like we said earlier about not every controversy is a foolish one. For example, I'll just give you one quick example that I've dealt with from time to time in my few years on this earth. There's from time to time, there have been controversies about a woman's responsibility to instructions that are given in 1 Corinthians 11 about a head covering. Now, is a controversy about that foolish? I say no. And the reason I say that is because some brethren, sisters and brethren are convinced in their mind and in their conscience that those instructions that Paul gives in 1 Corinthians 11 about a head covering apply to them just as much today as it did to brethren in New Testament times. And they are firmly convinced of that. I've also seen brethren who will belittle that and mock that and basically slander any woman who would dare to think that she might need to have her head covered when she is in the assembly engaging in prayer. And that mocking has disturbed me over the years. To see that someone is mocking the conscience of a fellow disciple. That's all I'll say about that. My view on that has changed over the years, but I think we need to respect the conscience of our brethren and be careful about whether we label something as foolish and worthless and meaningless that someone else may not view that way. Just like when Paul talks about eating of meats. He talks about he says, we know that there's nothing involved in eating of meats. You can do it or not do it. Whether it's been sacrificed to an idol, it doesn't really matter. Some brethren don't have that faith to view it that way, and we need to respect them regarding that. Now, the context of these passages, as I said earlier, doesn't talk about just avoid this, avoid that, avoid this, avoid that. He also talks about things to do, as we noticed in the context around Titus 3, when he says that the saying is trustworthy. those who have believed in God may be careful to devote themselves to good works. And Paul, if you look at the context, it's clear that Paul is setting up a not this, but this argument. And this is clear evidence as you would ever want to see of how important context is to give a fuller, clearer picture of what's being, the guidance that's being given here, this pastoral guidance that we're talking about in all these lessons. He said, avoid these kind of things, but on the other hand, you need to go after some things. Avoid this, but go after or pursue certain things. The passage in 2 Timothy 2:23, he says, verse 22, so flee youthful passions and pursue righteousness, faith, love, and peace along with those who call on the Lord from a pure heart. You flee some things, but you pursue other things. You avoid some things, but you go after some things. And in the context of the Titus passage, it really goes back all the way back to beginning about verse 7 of the previous chapter. Show yourself in all respects to be a model of good works. The end of verse 14, zealous for good works. Chapter 3, verse 1, to be ready for every good work. Well, we've already mentioned in verse 8, to devote themselves to good works. Verse 14, let our people learn to devote themselves to good works. It'd be hard to miss the context there. He's saying avoid certain things, but go after the good works. And by doing both of those, avoiding some things and engaging in the good works, we can help make God's doctrine more attractive.
David, I would also point out 2 Timothy 2:24. The Lord's bondservant must not be quarrelsome, but be kind to all, able to teach, patient when wrong, and so forth. So that's also a good response to the quarrelsome issues.
That's another one of those not this, but this arguments. Yes, Scripture has on a fair number of occasions instructions, don't do this, don't do that, avoid this, stay away from this, but it's also filled with things to say, go after this, pursue this. We stay away from the devil, but we're told to draw nigh to God, and he will draw nigh to you. Sandy.
To go along with what Lynn said, it's an action. It's not just not doing something. He's telling us to be gentle, but in that being gentle, we are to teach. We are to be active. It's the method in which we use our work for God. And in the past, I think, growing up during the debate time, it was a time that too many times it was about how you could take someone down and not how you could raise them up to the glory of God. And actively teach, actively go after wrong teaching, but it's the manner we are to follow Christ's example.
That's exactly right. Brethren, if any of you be overtaken in a fault, restore such a one in a spirit of gentleness, considering yourself lest you also be tempted. It's not saying you show that person who knows something. You put them in their place. That's not what he's saying at all. If our Christian life is all about just saying, I know more than you do, or I'm going to show you, we've got it all backwards. Anything else? Let's look at number 4. What's a passage from Romans that instructs Christians to avoid those who cause divisions? We've talked about things that cause divisions. What about people who cause divisions? What did you have as a passage from Romans?
Romans 16:7.
All right, and which says what, Barry?
says, I urge you, brothers, to watch out for those who cause divisions and put obstacles in your way that are contrary to the teaching you have learned. Keep away from them.
All right. He doesn't leave us doubting whether we should be in there participating with them. Watch out for them. Keep away from them. Those who cause divisions. That pretty much speaks for itself, does it not? Are we to avoid trying to correct those folks, to teach them? No, but we're to avoid getting caught up in the kinds of things that they do that cause the divisions. We're going to notice here in just a minute another passage that talks about getting caught up in kinds of things. Number 5, in context of 2 Timothy 3:5, certain people were to be avoided. What's at least 5 characteristics of such people?
Lack of self-control.
All right. What's another?
Lovers of self.
Lovers of self. Another.
According to a form of godliness.
Holding to a form of godliness. That's it. That's an interesting way of putting it, isn't it? That he did. Godliness is more than just a form, isn't it? What else?
Boasters.
Boasters. Proud.
Unloving.
Unloving. Arrogant. Disobedient to parents.
Yeah, that was interesting because about the men who were just disrespecting
Yeah.
disobedient.
Yes. Right. We immediately think of some examples that we see today of people disobedient to parents and showing no respect for the parents. I can't believe the way that boy or that girl talks to their mom or dad. Or lack of respect for parents, even if the boy or girl is 40 and the mom or dad is in their 60s. But that was not a problem in New Testament times, was it? Yes, it's always been a problem. All these different kinds of characteristics, these are people to be avoided. Be not deceived. God is not mocked. Whatsoever a person sows, that shall he also reap. And evil communications or companions corrupt good morals. Don't be deceived. And that's what we tell our kids when they're growing up, isn't it? Choose your friends carefully. The most popular people are not necessarily the people that you want to be buddies with. Some people are to be avoided. It's just as simple as that. And that's hard lessons for especially for preteens and teenagers to understand sometimes. That you don't have to do it in an ugly way. You don't have to say, stand up on your soapbox and say, I'm not going to have anything else to do with you. But you can still avoid close contact with folks like that. In both 1 Timothy 6:20 and 21 and 2 Timothy 2:16 to 18, Timothy was warned to avoid certain things. What impact might the things mentioned in these passages have on a person's faith?
Worldly and empty chatter is what is to be avoided there.
All right. And he said, what was happening to some people? Look at the passage in 2 Timothy chapter 2. He talks about Hymenaeus and Philetus. They got off on this tangent and had the wrong ideas about the resurrection. And what were they doing? What damage was being done? Upsetting some people's faith. Is that a big deal? Yes. This is not one of those things, it doesn't really make any difference in the long run. What difference does it make? Well, Paul here says it makes a big difference. It was upsetting people's faith. And Timothy was warned to avoid people. So the irreverent babble that he talks about here in the 2 Timothy chapter 2 is not the same as a foolish controversy that doesn't really matter. This is something that does matter. It's irreverent. It shows no reverence for God and respect for his word and his clear message, in this case, about the resurrection and what it was all about. And that is set in contrast to the verses preceding that, which we've already talked about in the previous lesson. Do your best to present yourself to God as one approved, a worker who has no need to be ashamed, rightly handling the word of truth. But, and he goes on to talk about avoiding irreverent babble and getting off on things that are away from, he says, that's in contrast to rightly handling the word of truth. You can rightly handle it, and as we said at the time, that clearly implies there's a wrong way to handle it. And he says to avoid that. Question 7, 1 Corinthians 5. Christians were not to even to eat with certain ones. Who does he say you're not even to eat with in 1 Corinthians 5?
Sexually immoral, greedy, and a couple of others.
Okay. What's happening in the context of 1 Corinthians 5? What's he talking about?
Church discipline.
All right. Church discipline. What was causing his comments about this? What was the situation?
They were tolerating certain forms of sexual sin inside the
All right.
congregation.
All right. So in the context, someone apparently was basically living with their stepmother, their father's wife, carrying on a sexual relationship. He said, not only is this bad, but what's even worse is that you people are tolerating this. He said, you cannot do that. And avoiding here got to be something of not just well, I want to steer clear of that. I don't have anything to do with it. It involved some specific action that was to be taken on their part. And we don't have time to go into all, but they were to deliver that person to Satan, Paul says. He says, don't you know a little leaven leavens the whole lump? You cannot keep going like this. That person has to be removed from you. You have to remove yourselves from that person. So avoiding here calls for some definitive action on their part. You cannot continue to tolerate that. That's not a foolish controversy. That's a controversy that ought to be nipped in the bud right then. Say, we are no longer going to put up with this. Because what does he mean when he says a little leaven leavens the whole lump? What does that mean? Okay, that's right. Don't you realize that this is allowed to continue? It's going to affect this whole church. You say, wake up. You've got to do something. These people say, oh, this guy, we're kind of cool here. This is a cool church. We're not going to judge anybody. You do what you want to do. I'll do what I want to do. And this cool church just says, I'm okay, you're okay. You ever heard that one before? He says, stop it right now.
Cool church will end up in lukewarm today.
Right. They're going to go from cool to lukewarm. Yeah. You got to take a stand somewhere. And then the last question, 2 Thessalonians 3, 6 through 12, Christians are told to avoid. What's happening in that context? People not working. They're idle. They got too much time on their hands. They did not do what he says here. Sometimes we're talking about somebody, you got too much time on your hands. Well, you got too much time on your hands because you didn't go after the good works. You're just sitting there idle. He says you've got to stay away from people like that because that causes trouble. People need to be encouraged to avoid this, but go after the good works. Idleness is the devil's workshop. Yes, that's in 3 Timothy that we're not going to be able to cover this morning.